Hello, my dear viewers. Welcome back to another incisive analysis of global economic and political drama right here on Boss Economics World. Today we're diving headfirst into a topic that has huge implications not only for Australia and New Zealand but for the interconnected networks of global economics, trade, and politics. As always, we're going to expose the shortcomings of both government policies and economic management that will inevitably create a tsunami of recession. But hey, that's what you're here for, right? So let's get right to the heart of the storm. Goldman Sachs recently downgraded its forecast for Australia's economic growth in 2025, cutting their estimate from 2% to 1.8%. While a 0.2% dip may seem like peanuts to an average observer, trust me, the actual implication is massive. And it's all due to a spiderweb of interconnected issues that, at their core, point to shaky governance, questionable economic decisions, and dangerous geopolitical positioning. What's driving this? The Trump effect, or rather, the looming return of Trump's protectionist policies, especially his favorite weapon, tariffs on China. These tariffs are expected to rise by up to 60% in 2025. For an economy as dependent on China as Australia, this is calamitous. China's been Australia's biggest trading partner for years, and any disruption in their economic dance has far-reaching impacts. Australia's export machine, particularly its raw materials sector such as iron ore and coal, could lose buyers or see price pressure that squeezes profitability. For a nation already suffering from historically high interest rates and sluggish consumer demand, the timing couldn't be worse. But let's not be too quick to point all fingers in the same direction. Australia's domestic policy blunders are as much to blame. You got a cocktail of rising rates, poor fiscal stimulus, and protectionist threats from across the Pacific, all leading to a downward growth spiral. There's a creeping sense that the government, the so-called economic stewards, have been sleepwalking toward an economic crisis. Australia's key interest rate sits at a 13-year high of 4.35%, a level that's literally suffocating consumer spending. Families are tightening their belts, mortgages are becoming unbearable, and home ownership is becoming a dream delayed indefinitely for first-time buyers. And what's Goldman Sachs' position on this? They're sticking to their guns on a dovish outlook, predicting the Reserve Bank will start easing rates in February 2025, potentially reducing the terminal rate to 3.25% by late next year. This is more optimistic than most. Financial markets aren't expecting any deceleration until later in 2025, but this rate cut is critical for one big reason: domestic consumption has stalled and needs a revival. To put a fine point on it, look at what happened since interest rate hikes started earlier this year. We've seen declines in consumer confidence, retail sales, and, let's not forget, real estate, which has become virtually unaffordable for the average Australian. In September of this year, the total household debt-to-income ratio rose to 186%, one of the highest in the world. This means that for every dollar an Aussie earns, they owe nearly two. What does that sound like? A ticking time bomb. If rate cuts come in early 2025, it might provide a small spark for consumer spending, but if it's too little, too late, watch out. Let's dig deeper into the second elephant in the room: US-China trade tensions under the next Trump administration. We all know Trump's rhetoric on China during his last stint in the White House: tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. And guess what? He's back with a vengeance, aiming for 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. His foreign policy has always operated under the guise of America first, but this now looks more like everyone else sinks. And Australia is one of the first oil spills from this new wave of policy. Since China's manufacturers rely on Australian raw materials like iron ore, coal, and liquefied natural gas to fuel their industrial output, tariffs on the finished goods mean less demand upstream. Now, Goldman Sachs forecasts that this uncertainty will spill over into Australian exports and hurt GDP growth. Trade statistics back this up. In 2023, China made up almost a third, more than 29.4%, of Australia's total exports, amounting to 150 billion Australian dollars. If the US and China engage in all-out trade warfare, Australia is likely to be collateral damage. This isn't just theory, either. We've seen how reliant Australia is on its China-dependent resource sector. For instance, in 2020, when China slapped tariffs on Australian barley, lobsters, and wine following Australia's call for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19, the impacts were severe. Barley shipments were redirected at lower prices, and exporters lost significant market share. Australia's already been burned once by geopolitical tensions, and it seems like they simply haven't learned from it. What we see now is that they haven't diversified enough away from China when it comes to trade, putting them in an extremely vulnerable position. Now, let's talk politics, because there's an election in Australia by May 2025. And what happens before elections? Goodies for voters. The centre-left Labour government has promised policies like energy rebates, expanded rental assistance, and even university debt reductions to ease the cost of living crisis. But trust me, this is what I call band-aid politics, short-term fixes aimed at winning elections rather than genuine attempts to steer the economy away from a potential recession. Australia is staring down the barrel of rising inflation, increased debt, and stagnant growth. Throwing free money at the issue isn't going to fix things in the long term. These policies, while popular, may simply inflate public debt without resolving underlying issues like productivity decline, wage stagnation, and an unsustainable housing market. And if Australia's wage pressure continues to outstrip productivity gains, as current labour market data suggests, inflation pressures will keep rearing their ugly head. To put it into perspective, Australian wage growth was measured at 3.9% in Q2 2023, its highest rate in about a decade. But here's the kicker, productivity growth in the same period was virtually flat, meaning you've got more wages chasing the same level of output. What does that lead to? Something that economists dread to see, inflation coupled with anemic economic gains. Now, we've concentrated plenty on Australia, but let's not leave out their friendly neighbour, New Zealand, which, surprise, surprise, also finds itself facing a challenging 2025. Similar factors afflict them, mainly inflationary pressures and recession fears. Goldman expects cuts in New Zealand's central bank rates in November and February, followed by smaller quarter-point reductions. They predict a terminal rate of around 3% by July 2025. But what's the main concern here? They've got the same problems as Australia, high inflation, low growth, and a household sector increasingly struggling to keep up. One issue plaguing New Zealand is its overheated housing market, which has been a source of immense stress. As of September 2023, home values in New Zealand were down 16% from their November 2021 peaks, but home affordability is still a critical issue. With housing averaging approximately 10 times the average household income, it's clear that the housing bubble has far from deflated. Like Australia, there's also widespread indebtedness, driven by a period of ultra-low interest rates that have now vanished in the rear-view mirror. In the wake of central bank tightening, household indebtedness as a share of disposable income is now sitting near a historic high of 181%. So what are we left with, comrades? A brewing storm, let me tell you that much. Maritime trade routes may stay the same, but economic realities are about to be completely restructured. If Australia doesn't dramatically shift its reliance on China, and if the US upsets global supply chains even more with new tariffs, Australia will feel that in a very sharp recessionary pinch. Goldman's estimates of rate cuts, especially compared to the broader market expectations, might give some Australians breathing room. But without clear political vision and a real excellent understanding of the global risks, Australia and New Zealand are looking at entering 2025 in a precarious state, walking a tightrope above a pool of economic uncertainty. It's high time governments stop playing temporary games and start focusing on long-term solutions. Our economies depend on it. Rather than spend billions on pre-election goodies, why not actually reduce the structural stress in the system? Invest in R&D, focus on infrastructure, and diversify trade relationships beyond a handful of partners. Short-termism benefits no one, and it's the people, not politicians, who will end up paying the bill. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Boss Economics World. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so we can keep holding economics and governments accountable.